Hello there, and welcome to Forgotten Worlds. My name is Thomas, and tonight I'd like to invite you into a question most of us never pause to consider. We live our lives beneath an invisible shield. You don't see it when you look at the sky. You don't hear it in the wind or feel it pressing against your skin, and yet, without it, you wouldn't be here. None of us would. It is Earth's magnetic field, a vast, unseen guardian, stretching out from the heart of the planet into the silence of space. But what if it were gone? Imagine, just for a moment, waking to a world where that silent shield had vanished overnight. The skies would look the same, at least at first. The sun would still rise. The oceans would still breathe against the shore. And yet, above you, a storm of invisible forces would already be moving in solar winds, cosmic rays, radiation from the wider galaxy, no longer deflected, no longer softened, Earth exposed as bare and vulnerable as Mars. This is not a debate, not an answer waiting at the end of a line of equations. It is an exploration of the dynamo deep within Earth's molten core, of the shimmering auroras that mark the edges of its power, and of the fragile thread of protection that makes our lives possible. So take a breath, let your day fall away, and let's wander together into this thought. What if Earth's magnetic field disappeared? To begin, we need to look inward into the restless fire beneath our feet, into the dynamo at the very heart of the planet. Far beneath the ground you walk upon, deeper than any mind could ever reach, lies a world of heat and motion. It is a place we can never visit, not with drills, not with machines, not even with the imagination of an astronaut, and yet, its movements shape the sky itself. This is Earth's outer core, a vast ocean of molten iron and nickel, liquid metal swirling slowly around a solid inner heart. Picture it for a moment. An ocean that is not water but fire. Rivers of glowing alloy, currents thicker than stone, flowing in great loops around the center of the world. The heat comes from the planet's birth, from ancient collisions, radioactive decay, and the pressure of all that weight above pressing inward. That heat keeps the metal in motion, and as the Earth spins, those motions begin to align. The result is what scientists call the geodynamo, the great engine of the magnetic field. If you've ever turned a bicycle wheel with a magnet clipped to its edge, or watched the hands of a compass twitch near an electrical wire, you've seen a faint echo of this process. Moving metal, carrying charge, creates a magnetic field. Down in the outer core, that process happens on a scale almost too large to comprehend. Giant loops of molten iron act like vast electrical circuits, their flow twisted by the turning of the planet, their patterns folding and stretching like smoke caught in the wind. And from this churning sea of metal, invisible lines of force rise. They push upward, outward, extending through the mantle, passing the crust, breaking free into the air, and then out into space. Imagine them like threads of light, arching from the south to the north, looping back again in endless curves. If your eyes could see magnetism instead of color, the sky would not be empty. It would be laced with glowing arcs, shimmering rivers of power streaming into the night. These lines join together to form a vast cocoon, the magnetosphere. It balloons around Earth, pressed against the constant flow of solar wind streaming from the sunday. On the day side, the field is compressed into a rounded shield. On the night side, it stretches far into a long tail, a comet of invisible strength trailing behind us as we orbit through space. Inside it, life thrives. Outside, the cosmos seethes with radiation. Think of what this means. Every time you breathe, every time you raise your eyes to the stars, you are standing within a protective bubble forged by the restless fire of Earth's heart. You may never feel its presence directly, but without it, the air you draw into your lungs might never have survived. And yet, like all shields, it is not unchanging. The geodynamo flickers, drifts, even reverses. The magnetic poles wander, sometimes slowly, sometimes with surprising haste. Scientists track them as they slide across the Arctic, measuring the subtle dance of a force that seems eternal but is, in truth, fragile. So, as we begin to imagine a world without this protection, it helps to linger here for a moment in the knowledge that the magnetic field is not a gift from outside, but something born deep within the earth itself. A silent companion, rising from the heat of creation, shaping the sky into a shield. And that brings us to its role above us, the shield itself, and the way it bends the winds of the sun into a harmless glow. High above your head, far beyond the clouds and the calm blue we take for granted, space is not quiet. It is not empty. It is alive with streams of energy, invisible storms hurled outward from the Sunday. Scientists call it the solar wind, a river of charged particles rushing through the solar system at hundreds of kilometers per second. It never stops. It washes past the planets endlessly, a tide of plasma flowing outward in all directions. Now, imagine Earth without its shield. That constant wind would slam into our atmosphere directly, stripping it molecule by molecule, eroding it grain by grain the way sandpaper wears down wood. The gentle air you breathe would be peeled away, thinning under the relentless pressure until little remained. But in our world, in the world we know, that doesn't happen, because the magnetic field stands between us and the storm. The magnetosphere is like a bow wave, parting the flow, bending it around us. Most of the solar wind never touches the Earth at all. It is caught, slowed, and diverted into the long magnetic tail streaming away from the night side. Still, not everything is deflected. Some particles spiral down along the magnetic lines, funneled toward the poles where the field dips closest to the planet. And when they collide with our atmosphere, they create one of the most haunting sights nature has ever offered: the aurora. Curtains of green, pink, and violet shimmer across polar skies, silent reminders of the battle being waged above. Beautiful, yes, but also a glimpse of what constant radiation would look like if the shield were not there. This protective barrier does more than block the Sunday. It also keeps at bay the far stranger guests from beyond. Cosmic rays, high-energy particles born in distant supernovae, sweep through the galaxy at near light speed. They are ancient travelers, fragments of stars long dead, carrying enough energy to slice through DNA, to disrupt electronics, to slowly unravel the delicate balance of life. Without Earth's magnetic field, many of these rays would pour straight onto the surface, turning the very ground beneath your feet into a place of radiation storms. To see what that might mean, you only have to look toward Mars. That small red world once had its own magnetic field. Evidence suggests it flickered out billions of years ago, its core cooling, its dynamo stilled. With no shield left to hold them back, the solar winds swept across its skies unhindered. Over millions of years, they stripped much of its atmosphere away, leaving only a thin veil of carbon dioxide clinging to the surface. The oceans dried. The air thinned. And what remains today is a silent desert, battered by radiation, frozen and dry beneath the endless night. Mars, in a way, is a warning, a glimpse of what happens to a living world when its invisible guardian disappears. Earth is larger, warmer, more complex, but even here, exposure to raw space would change everything. When you step outside and feel the warmth of the sun, you rarely think of the violence hidden within that light. Yet, every second, flares erupt on its surface, releasing storms powerful enough to fry satellites, disrupt communication, and overload electrical grids even through our shield. Without the magnetic field, those storms would not just flicker across power lines, they would reach your skin. They would bathe forests, rivers, and cities in waves of charged radiation. It is a strange thought, isn't it? That so much of our comfort depends on something we cannot see, a bubble of force that keeps space itself at arm's length. Without it, the Earth would slowly follow the path of Mars, air bleeding away, water fading, life retreating underground or vanishing altogether. The shield above us is not invincible. It bends. it flexes, sometimes it weakens, but for now, it holds. And in holding, it gives us the world we know, a world of skies, oceans, forests, and fragile human lives able to grow and dream beneath its silent arc. And yet, if this shield were to falter, if it were to disappear even for a short while, what would the first hours of such a world look like? The moment the magnetic field flickered out, the change would be silent. You would not hear a crash or feel the ground tremble. The air would still be there, the ocean would still rise and fall, and the morning sun would climb as if nothing had shifted. But high above, far beyond the reach of your eyes, the storm would begin at once. The solar wind, which has always been held at bay, would strike the upper atmosphere head-on. Particles traveling at hundreds of kilometers per second would pour into the sky unchecked, tearing at the fragile veil of air with every collision. To most of us, the first hours might feel unchanged. But in orbit, where satellites circle the Earth like silent beads of light, chaos would already be spreading. Satellites are built with shielding, yes, but not for a world without a magnetosphere. Within hours, radiation would overwhelm their delicate electronics. GPS signals would falter, weather satellites would go dark. Communications relays would spark with noise until their circuits gave out. The space above our heads, once alive with the invisible hum of information, would grow strangely quiet. Down below, the effects would ripple outward. Power grids, tuned to operate within stable limits, would feel the surge of charged particles raining down through the ionosphere. In the first day, transformers might burn out. Whole regions could fall into blackout, not because of storms in the sky, but because the currents in the atmosphere had suddenly grown wild and unpredictable. Imagine the confusion. Planes grounded without navigation, ships at sea without coordinates, phones unable to connect across long distances. Within a few hours, the intricate web of global communication, satellites, signals, timing systems would begin to fray. We are so used to their quiet, invisible presence that their absence would feel uncanny, as if the world had suddenly slipped back into an older time. For those on the ground, the first signs would come not from darkness, but from light. Strange colors would spill across the skies, far from the poles, shimmering over cities unaccustomed to auroras. Greens, purples, and scarlets would dance above skyscrapers and farmland alike, a display so beautiful that many might step outside to watch. And yet, that beauty would be laced with danger. Those auroras would not be harmless, curtains of light, they would be the scars of radiation pouring into the atmosphere. Scientists have warned of this possibility for decades. Solar storms, even with our magnetic shield intact, have fried telegraph lines in the 1800s, knocked out power in Canada in the 1980s, and threatened satellites during modern flares. Without the field, those effects would no longer be rare disasters, they would be the normal state of things. The first hours, then, would be a quiet unmasking, not the end of life in an instant, but the beginning of a slow unraveling. Above us, satellites would flicker and fail. Around us, the grids and wires that carry our electricity would strain and break. And in the skies, the auroras would whisper the truth. Earth was no longer protected. And as the hours turned to days, the storms would deepen. Radiation, unchecked, would begin to touch the ground. At first, the radiation would seem distant, a problem for machines, not for people. Satellites burning out, grids flickering, these are abstractions, things you read about in headlines. But as the days wore on, the storm would draw closer, pressing downward through the thinning shield until it touched the ground itself. Cosmic rays, once bent harmlessly aside, would now fall directly upon the Earth. Each particle is unimaginably small, yet each carries the energy of a bullet fired from deep space, born in explosions that tore stars apart millions of years ago. Normally, our magnetic cocoon turns them away, but now they would strike the atmosphere with abandon, shattering molecules. sending cascades of secondary particles rushing downward like invisible rain. If you were standing outside, you would not see them. You might not feel them at first, but their presence would be everywhere in the soil, in the air, in the cells of your own body. DNA would twist and break under the assault. The odds of mutation would rise, cancer rates would climb, not in centuries but in weeks and months. And all the while, the skies would put on a show so strange it might feel like a dream. Auroras, once confined to the polar regions, would spill toward the equator. Entire continents would be bathed in shimmering veils of green and violet. Cities like Cairo, Mumbai, and Rio de Janeiro might find their night skies lit up with curtains of fire, as if the heavens themselves had been set alight. People would gather on rooftops, marveling at the beauty, unaware that the colors dancing above were signs of particles tearing into the upper atmosphere. The auroras would no longer be rare or special, they would be constant. The night sky would be alive with them, a permanent theater of shifting light. But this theater would be deadly, a luminous reminder that radiation storms were now part of daily life. Air travel would become perilous. Pilots and passengers flying through high altitudes would find themselves exposed to doses of cosmic radiation strong enough to sicken or kill. Electronics on planes would fail more often, compasses would spin, guidance systems would fall silent. Long-distance flight might be abandoned altogether, not by choice but by necessity. Animals, too, would feel the change. Migrating birds guided by the magnetic field would wheel through the sky in confusion, their instincts betrayed. Sea turtles returning to ancestral beaches would lose their path. Insects, whose migrations stitch ecosystems together, would scatter aimlessly, their maps erased. The invisible order that life has relied upon for millions of years would begin to collapse under the invisible storm. And yet, in the human mind, contradiction would take root. Because how could something so devastating look so achingly beautiful? Every horizon shimmering with colored light, every night turned into a festival of celestial fire. Perhaps, at least for a while, people would cling to that beauty, even as scientists warned of the danger it disguised. But beneath that beauty, the truth would not change. The skies, so radiant and alive, would be killing the world below. The true danger would not come in a flash. It would arrive slowly, invisibly, like a tide wearing away the shore. Without the magnetic field, the solar wind would no longer be a passing storm deflected into space. It would be a constant gale pressing against the upper atmosphere, stripping particles away with every heartbeat of the Sunday. Imagine the air above you not as empty space, but as a delicate veil, thin, fragile, stretched across the curve of the world. That veil is what holds warmth close to the surface, what softens the sun's fire into light you can live beneath, what carries every breath you take into your lungs. Without protection, the solar wind would begin to unravel it, thread by thread. It has happened before. Mars bears the scars of it. Billions of years ago, the red planet may have known rivers and seas. Its valleys speak of flowing water, its minerals whisper of ancient lakes. But its core cooled too quickly, its dynamo stilled, and the magnetic shield fell silent. From that moment on, the solar wind had free rein. Over time, it scoured the sky away, peeling the atmosphere until little was left but a thin whisper of carbon dioxide. The oceans vanished. The rivers dried into dust. What remains today is a desert planet, frozen and exposed, a world where silence stretches farther than any horizon. Earth is larger, richer, more alive, but even here, the same process would unfold if the shield were gone. The atmosphere would not vanish overnight. For weeks, for months, life would go on, but the erosion would be steady. Every gust of solar wind would carry a little more of the sky into space. Every solar flare would strip more layers from the upper atmosphere. Slowly, the balance would tip. At first, you might notice little. The air would still be thick enough to breathe, the oceans still vast enough to cradle life. But in the higher reaches of the atmosphere, changes would stir. The ionosphere, normally alive with charged particles caught in the magnetic field, would thin and fade. The upper layers of oxygen and nitrogen would be swept away, leaving the lower atmosphere more vulnerable. Over decades, then centuries, the erosion would descend, reaching closer to the ground. Think of standing outside and taking a deep breath, knowing that the very air filling your lungs is not guaranteed. That one day, if the process continued long enough, the skies above might thin the way Mars's did, until sound carried differently, until the winds weakened, until silence deepened in ways we can barely imagine. The Earth would still fight back. Gravity would hold much of the atmosphere close. Volcanic eruptions might release new gases, replenishing some of what was lost. Life itself would adapt, as it has so many times before. But the steady press of the solar wind is relentless, a sculptor that never stops carving, and in time, even the strongest defenses yield. This, then, is the fate of a world without its magnetic field. Not sudden destruction, but slow erosion. Not a single cataclysm, but a steady unraveling of the shield that makes breath, weather, and life possible. And as the atmosphere wears thin, another loss would begin to follow, the very oxygen that allows you to breathe. The air you breathe feels eternal. You do not wake in the morning wondering if there will be enough of it, nor do you glance at the sky with doubt. It is simply there, invisible and endless. Yet in a world where the magnetic field has fallen silent, even this certainty begins to falter. As the solar wind strips at the upper atmosphere, it is not only nitrogen and carbon dioxide that drift into space, oxygen is lost too. Not all at once, but in whispers. Molecule by molecule, it escapes the planet's grasp, carried away into the void. At first, the change would be imperceptible. Trees would still rustle with green, oceans would still foam with waves, and your chest would still rise and fall with breath. But as decades stretch into centuries, the depletion would grow undeniable. Scientists studying Mars have seen this pattern. Once, that planet may have had air dense enough to cradle oceans. But as its magnetic field died, the oxygen thinned until it was almost gone. What remains there today could never sustain a single breath. Earth, larger and heavier, would resist longer, but resistance is not the same as permanence. Imagine walking outside and noticing that the sky seems just a little different. Its blue a shade paler, its clouds thinner, the air sharper in your lungs. Over time, these changes would deepen. The sounds of the world might shift. Birdsong might carry differently in thinning air. Winds might lose some of their voice, and silence might creep into the edges of daily life. Forests would struggle first. Leaves, starved of the balance they have known for millions of years, would yellow more quickly, their cycles disturbed. Oxygen producers, the trees, the algae, the plankton of the seas would fight to compensate, but their efforts would be undone by the erosion above. Every exhalation of breath would return to an atmosphere less able to hold it, and so the world would grow quieter, not instantly, not dramatically, but with the slow hush of a theater dimming its lights. Skies thinning into silence, winds muted. The chorus of life reduced in subtle ways until even the ordinary act of breathing would feel fragile, precious, no longer guaranteed. Speculation brings the thought to its most haunting form. Perhaps, in the far future of such a world, humanity might live in bubbles of preserved air, domes built to hold what the sky could no longer provide. Perhaps the memory of a breathable Earth would become myth, a story told of a time when you could walk outside, lift your face to the wind, and fill your lungs without thought or fear. The loss of oxygen would not only change the air, it would change the rhythm of life itself. And with it, the climate would begin to shift into chaos. When the magnetic field falters, the atmosphere is not the only thing at risk. The ozone layer, that fragile band of molecules suspended high above us, is one of the first to suffer. Ozone is Earth's sunshield, filtering ultraviolet radiation into gentler light. Without it, the sun's rays arrive raw, untempered, carrying an intensity that flesh and leaf alike cannot endure. Picture a summer day under this altered sky. The warmth on your skin would feel harsher, sharper, as though the light itself had grown teeth. Sunburn would no longer be the nuisance of a careless afternoon, but a daily threat. Cancers would surge. The DNA of plants, animals, even microbes would unravel under the bombardment. Forests would wither at their edges. Crops would fail more often, their growth stunted by radiation. Plankton in the oceans, the foundation of countless food chains, would decline as sunlight cut deeper than before. The rhythm of life, tuned for eons to the balance of filtered light, would stumble. And with the ozone diminished, the climate would grow unstable in ways both immediate and subtle. Ultraviolet light heats the atmosphere unevenly, disrupting jet streams that guide winds across the globe. Weather patterns would twist, seasons would become unpredictable, and storms would gather with a violence unfamiliar to us. You might wake to skies that feel wrong, clouds too high, winds too restless, heat too sudden. The dependable cycles of Earth's climate, the patterns that farmers and travelers and entire civilizations have relied upon, would falter. Radiation storms from the sun, once softened by the magnetosphere and ozone alike, would now reach the ground with their full force. Each flare would bring spikes of UV that sear the surface, scorching crops, bleaching soil, and setting ecosystems on edge. Life would continue, yes, but under constant siege. It is strange to think that something so small, a trio of oxygen atoms bound together, could mean the difference between a living world and a barren one. And yet, that thin band of ozone is precisely what makes our surface hospitable. Without it, Earth begins to resemble not the lush home we know, but the harsh, unforgiving glare of worlds like Venus, where sunlight crushes rather than sustains. And as the shield of ozone unravels, the deeper machinery of climate, the winds, the currents, the rains would begin to follow, falling into a chaos that no season could predict. When the great circulations of air and ocean lose their balance, the world does not simply become a little warmer or a little colder. It becomes unstable in ways that touch every horizon. Jet streams, those high-altitude rivers of wind that guide storms across continents, would begin to falter. Without the stabilizing layers of atmosphere and the shielding of the magnetic field, they would twist, slow, and sometimes reverse, dragging weather into places it does not belong. Deserts would spread outward as rains fail, inching across farmland and grassland alike. The line between fertile earth and barren sand would shift year by year until whole regions found themselves swallowed by dust. Rivers that once flowed steadily would vanish in their upper reaches, their sources diminished by drought, their mouths clogged with silt. Elsewhere, the opposite fate would unfold. Storms, fueled by chaotic winds and unfiltered sunlight, would gather with terrifying power. Rain would fall not in gentle showers, but in endless torrents. Coastlines would be battered by tempests without pattern or mercy. Hurricanes, once seasonal, could linger for months, circling seas that no longer knew how to rest. Imagine a world where the seasons no longer answer to the calendar. Winter snows might vanish in places that once depended on them, leaving mountains bare and rivers dry. Tropical rains might flood regions that had never known them, turning fields to swamps, displacing entire cities. The predictability of climate, the quiet rhythm that underpins agriculture, settlement, and survival would dissolve into disorder. Speculation stretches further still. Perhaps deserts would merge across continents, creating vast belts of arid land stretching thousands of kilometers, seas of dust broken only by skeletal forests. Perhaps, in other regions, storms would become so constant that entire coasts would be abandoned, their skies perpetually dark with thunderheads, their lands drowned beneath unending rain. Civilization, built upon the stability of seasons, would find itself adrift. The farmer who once trusted the rains would see crops wither or drown. The traveler who once crossed seas in predictable weather would face oceans in constant turmoil. The architect who once designed for summer and winter would face climates that shifted within weeks. And through it all, humanity would struggle not just with the heat of the sun or the lash of the storms, but with the absence of certainty. For what vanishes in climate chaos is not only comfort, it is the ability to know, to prepare, to trust that tomorrow will resemble today. This is the stage upon which life would continue, a planet of shifting sands and endless storms, where the familiar boundaries of desert, forest, and sea would be redrawn again and again. A world in motion, but motion without rhythm. Beneath skies that no longer filter the sun's fire, the surface of Earth would begin to change in ways both subtle and devastating. The magnetic field, once a shield invisible yet absolute, would no longer scatter radiation into harmless dances of light at the poles. Instead, cosmic rays and solar particles would fall freely, unbroken, onto the ground. Every sunrise would not simply bring warmth, but a storm of invisible arrows, threading silently through the air, through bodies, through the fragile scaffolding of life itself. Radiation is patient but merciless. You cannot see it or smell it, but it leaves fingerprints on the very code of existence. DNA, that intricate spiral of nucleotides, carrying the memory of every ancestor and the instructions for every future, is not indestructible. Its double helix is strong enough to span billions of years of evolution, yet delicate enough to fray under too much strain. Struck again and again by high-energy particles, its bonds would snap, its letters scrambled. Cells would attempt repair, as they always do, patching broken strands, rewriting missing sequences. Sometimes those repairs would succeed. Sometimes they would fail, and in those failures, mutation would take root. At first, the effects might pass unnoticed, hidden in statistics, whispered in medical journals. Skin cancers would rise quietly, like shadows spreading beneath the skin of populations. Hospital wards would begin to fill, not all at once, but steadily. Farmers might notice something stranger still. Their seeds, once reliable, would sprout irregularly. Some stalks would twist oddly in the soil, their leaves mottled. Others would refuse to grow at all. Mutations would ripple through crops as radiation worked its way into their genetic code. The harvests that did succeed would shrink, their nourishment diminished. Food, the anchor of human stability, would become less certain with each passing season. Animals would bear the scars as well. Birds might hatch with weakened wings. Mammals might carry deformities, subtle at first, a shortened limb, an unusual coloration but increasingly common. Insects, whose lives turned quickly across generations, would mutate even faster, their populations becoming unpredictable, their ecological roles destabilized. Pollinators might falter, their instincts dulled, their fragile bodies undone by radiation damage. Ecosystems balanced across millions of years would begin to unravel in mere decades. And then there are the children. New life, fragile and unshielded, would carry the heaviest burden. Radiation does not distinguish between the living and the unborn. It pierces through skin, through womb, through generations. Mutations passed into embryos would not be gentle. Some pregnancies would fail before they began. Others would carry forward but with silent changes written into the DNA. In time, humanity would see the effects in its youngest: rising infant mortality, illnesses difficult to cure, a subtle erosion of health across entire generations. Populations would shrink not through one catastrophe, but through the slow grinding pressure of sickness and infertility. The Earth's surface, once the cradle of abundance, would begin to resemble a battlefield. But the combatants would not be armies of flesh and steel. They would be forces invisible to the eye, radiation threading through every breath of air, every sip of water, every meal pulled from the soil. The battlefield would be inside the body itself, in the cells, in the fragile choreography of molecules that make life possible. Some species would vanish almost immediately, unable to endure the constant storm. Amphibians, already sensitive to the smallest changes in water and air, would wither in silence. Coral reefs, already fragile, would bleach and die under the twin assault of radiation and climate chaos. The keystones of ecosystems would topple, pulling countless others down with them, and yet, life is nothing if not stubborn. Even here, in this poisoned sunlight, survivors would remain. Perhaps some organisms would adapt, learning to thrive under conditions that once seemed impossible. Bacteria might develop faster, more efficient DNA repair mechanisms. Certain insects might harden their shells, shielding themselves in ways more effective than we can imagine. Evolution, pushed into overdrive by the pressure of radiation, would stumble forward, reshaping the living world in unpredictable ways. New forms would rise, not by choice, but by necessity. For humanity, however, the outlook would be far less forgiving. Cities would begin to hollow out as illness spread and food became unreliable. Hospitals would become overwhelmed, then abandoned, as treatments failed to keep pace with the new reality. Protective suits and shelters would become essential for those who still tried to work or travel on the surface. Life outdoors would shrink to minutes or hours at a time, measured not in comfort but in risk. Daily existence would grow shorter, harsher, more uncertain. Communities would weaken as families lost members, as leaders faced impossible choices, as trust in the future dwindled. The sun, once a symbol of warmth and hope, would become a reminder of danger, its light both necessary and lethal. Yet even in such despair, humanity would cling to survival. Some would experiment with protective domes, filtering air and shielding light. Others would rely on technology, medical treatments, genetic engineering to slow the tide of mutations. And still others, facing the futility of the surface, would begin to turn their eyes downward, toward the safety of caves, bunkers, and the oceans. Because in time, the surface of Earth would no longer feel like home, it would feel like exile, a place where every sunrise carried not just light, but death stitched invisibly into its rays. This is what life on the surface might become, fragile, shortened, and always overshadowed by the quiet storm from above. And so, inevitably, the human story would begin to retreat downward, into the dark. When the surface grows too hostile, survival demands retreat. It is not the first time life on Earth has faced such a choice. Billions of years ago, in the planet's earliest days, when the young sun blazed fiercely and the atmosphere offered little protection, life sought safety in water and stone. Microbes sheltered in deep oceans, in cracks of rock, in the shaded corners of a world not yet ready to host them in the open. Now, in a world stripped of its magnetic shield, humanity would echo that ancient instinct, retreating into the hidden places of the earth. Picture vast underground cities carved into mountains, their entrances sealed, their walls layered with rock to block the constant storm of radiation. Above, the world would shimmer with deadly auroras, but below, in chambers lit by artificial suns, communities would endure. Farms would move indoors, crops grown beneath LEDs, watered by recycled streams. Air would be filtered, oxygen replenished by machines that mimic the forests lost above. Caves, once the homes of early humans, might again become sanctuaries. Natural caverns expanded into habitable depths, their ceilings reinforced, their stone walls serving as the shield that the planet itself could no longer provide. In these hidden networks, generations could pass without seeing the sky, the stories of stars and sunlight becoming legends told to children who had never felt the warmth of day on their skin. Some might look to the oceans instead. Water is a shield as well, far more effective than air at softening radiation. Beneath the waves, where sunlight fades to twilight and pressure mounts, humanity might find its future. Habitats could be anchored to the seafloor, domes of glass and metal housing families, laboratories, and farms of seaweed and fish. Life would continue beneath the waves much as it did in Earth's beginning, when the first cells thrived in the dark, hidden from the punishing light above. It would not be easy. Underground life demands constant vigilance. Power must be maintained, air must be purified, water must be cycled endlessly. Any failure could spell disaster for entire communities. And yet, survival has always required adaptation, and necessity sharpens invention. The skills of engineers and scientists would become as vital as air itself. In these refuges, society would change. Days and nights would be artificial, measured not by the rising sun, but by the rhythms of machines. Festivals might no longer honor the harvest or the solstice, but instead the successful repair of a generator or the birth of a child against the odds. Memory of the surface would fade into myth, a place once open and bright, now dangerous and forbidden. It is a haunting symmetry. Life began hidden, sheltered from a hostile world, and in this imagined future it would return to the dark once more. The arc of survival bends back upon itself, as if the story of life on Earth were a spiral, circling through epochs of light and shadow. Some would wonder if humanity could endure such confinement, generation after generation beneath stone or sea. Others would ask whether it was truly living at all, or merely existing. But in times of desperation, survival itself becomes a kind of triumph. To breathe in the dark is better than silence. To live without sky is better than not to live at all. And so, if the magnetic field were to vanish, the human story might not end. It would continue in echoes, echoes of microbes hidden in ancient oceans, echoes of ancestors crouched in caves during ice ages, echoes of resilience woven into the fabric of life itself. The setting would change, the sky would be lost, but the will to endure would remain. In this imagined world, Earth's surface would no longer belong to us. It would belong to storms, to silence, to radiation. But beneath it, in the secret places of stone and sea, the human story would go on. While humanity turned inward, burrowing into stone and sea for survival, the rest of the living world would face its own trials. For countless species, survival is not about sheltering in place, but about moving, traveling vast distances across land, sky, and ocean in patterns so ancient they are written into instinct. Migration is one of nature's great symphonies, and at its heart lies a hidden conductor, the Earth's magnetic field. Many creatures you know rely on it in ways we are only beginning to understand. Birds, for instance, do not simply navigate by sight. Experiments have shown that some species can see magnetic lines as faint visual patterns in the sky, a sense as real to them as color is to you. A robin in your garden, a swallow crossing an ocean, a crane flying across continents, each is guided not only by stars and landmarks but by an invisible compass woven into their very biology. Sea turtles hatch upon a beach and, against all odds, find their way to the sea. Years later, fully grown, they return to that same stretch of sand with uncanny precision. Their secret lies in magnetic imprinting, a memory of the Earth's field at the place of their birth, encoded into their nervous system. Without that magnetic cue, the ocean becomes endless, directionless. Their life cycle, perfected over millions of years, begins to fail. Even insects, fragile and fleeting as they may seem, depend on this silent force. Monarch butterflies, weighing less than a paperclip, navigate thousands of kilometers from Canada to Mexico, guided in part by magnetism. Bees, ants, even some bacteria use the magnetic field to orient themselves. Strip away that compass, and their journeys falter. Now imagine a world where that guidance is gone. The skies would be filled with birds flying not in elegant lines but in confused spirals, their migrations collapsing into chaos. Turtles would wander the oceans aimlessly, their ancient paths erased. Swarms of insects would scatter, disrupting the pollination that ecosystems rely upon. Entire food webs built on the reliable rhythms of migration would begin to crumble. Without migrating fish, coastal communities would lose a vital food source. Without birds arriving to eat pests or spread seeds, forests would thin and weaken. The collapse would not be immediate, but it would be relentless. A chain reaction spreading outward from the smallest disoriented insect to the largest predator waiting for its prey. The tragedy here lies in the quietness of it. No single event announces the end of migration. There would be no great extinction in a day, no cataclysmic roar. Instead, it would unfold in silence, birds failing to return in spring, beaches growing emptier of turtles with each passing year, skies thinning of the familiar flocks that once marked the turning of seasons. For humanity, struggling in its underground refuges, these losses would deepen the sense of disconnection. The sounds of migratory birds at dawn, the sight of butterflies drifting across meadows, the arrival of salmon in rivers, these are not just ecological events but cultural ones. Their absence would echo in songs, in stories, in the rhythms of life passed down through generations. Without the magnetic field, the ancient choreography of migration would unravel, and with it, the balance of ecosystems that depend on those journeys would begin to collapse. When migrations falter, ecosystems do not simply lose a detail, they lose their rhythm. The movements of animals are threads in a vast tapestry, binding forests, oceans, and grasslands together. Pull on those threads, and the weave begins to loosen. One species stumbles, then another, until the entire fabric of life starts to unravel. Consider the birds that once carried seeds across continents. Without their journeys, forests would thin at their edges. Trees would no longer spread as widely, leaving open ground where grasses or deserts might take hold. The great migrations of ungulates wildebeest on the savanna, caribou in the tundra, would collapse without reliable seasons or guiding cues, and the predators that followed them would face famine. Pollinators would fare no better. Butterflies, bees, and beetles, already sensitive to the smallest changes in climate, would scatter without magnetic guidance. Crops would fail more often. Wildflowers would vanish from meadows. What seems like a small silence, fewer insects buzzing in the air, would echo upward through entire ecosystems, reshaping what could live and what could not. In the oceans, the effects would spread just as deeply. Fish that once traveled in great migrations, salmon returning upriver, herrings sweeping across seas, would lose their bearings. Entire schools might wander until they starved. Whales and dolphins, creatures known to strand themselves when magnetic anomalies confused them, would do so far more often. The ocean's highways, once alive with motion, would grow emptier, leaving behind a silence even more profound than on land. And with each loss, the balance would tilt further. Predators would starve, scavengers would diminish. Plants dependent on pollination or seed dispersal would thin until their ecosystems collapsed. Food webs that had endured for millions of years would fray in a matter of generations. Speculation paints this unraveling not only in biological terms but in emotional ones. Imagine a meadow without birdsong, a coastline without seabirds diving, an ocean without the flicker of schools darting beneath the waves. The absence would be felt not just in science but in the human spirit. For we are creatures woven into these webs too, our myths, our art, our very sense of place shaped by the animals around us. Without them, the world would feel emptier, its beauty diminished even as survival grew harder. Some species might adapt, carving out niches in the chaos. Others might rise in unexpected ways, filling gaps left behind. Evolution has always rewritten the cast of life when great pressures fall. Yet the pace of change here would be staggering, and the age of unraveling might outstrip the age of renewal. What would remain is a world transformed, not dead, but altered beyond recognition. A patchwork of survivors, scattered and fragile, trying to rebuild order where the old symphony of migration had fallen silent. And while the natural world bent and broke under these forces, human civilization would face its own collapse, not only in its ecosystems, but in its technology. For much of human history, survival meant fire, shelter, and food. But in the modern age, our survival has been rewoven into something more fragile: electricity, satellites, and networks of machines we rarely see but always depend on. When Earth's magnetic field disappears, this hidden skeleton of civilization becomes one of the first casualties. Satellites, those silent guardians circling above the Earth, are more vulnerable than most realize. Their bodies are thin shells of metal, their lifeblood made of delicate circuits and solar panels. Even with the magnetic field in place, solar storms have threatened them. A powerful flare can disrupt signals, drain batteries, or even knock a satellite out of orbit. Without the shield, the damage would not come in spikes and bursts, but as a constant flood. Radiation would pierce their electronics relentlessly. Guidance systems would falter, cameras would blur, transmitters would fail. One by one, the glowing beads in the sky would wink out, leaving the world below cut off from their watchful presence. The loss would ripple instantly. GPS, the silent compass guiding planes, ships, and even your phone's maps would vanish. Weather forecasting, which relies on satellites peering down into clouds and storms, would grow blind. Communication relays, which carry voices, data, and signals across oceans, would dissolve into static. The global web of satellites, painstakingly built over decades, would collapse in days. But the devastation would not end above. On the ground, the same storm of particles would weave into the atmosphere, generating electrical currents that surge into the long veins of human infrastructure. Power grids. Transformers, those massive machines that balance and distribute electricity, are particularly vulnerable. With no magnetic field to blunt the blow, solar storms would overload them one after another. Imagine entire cities sinking into darkness not because of local failure, but because the very structure of the grid had melted from within. Lights flickering out across neighborhoods, hospitals struggling on backup power, factories grinding to a halt. The hum of civilization, that quiet, steady vibration of machines, wires, and energy would fall silent. And unlike storms of the past, repair would not be a matter of days or weeks. Replacing transformers requires manufacturing, shipping, and coordination. In a world where satellites are gone and supply chains are fractured, the process would stretch into months or years. Some regions might never recover, left in darkness as others fought to hoard dwindling resources. Daily life would unravel in ways most could hardly imagine. Refrigerators would warm spoiling food. Water pumps reliant on electricity would fail, cutting cities off from clean supplies. Hospitals, once bastions of resilience, would grow desperate without steady power, their machines silenced. Even the simple act of turning on a light would become a memory, replaced by candles, fires, and improvisation. The irony is sharp. Humanity, so proud of its technological achievements, would discover how fragile they are when stripped of their invisible protector. Our machines, designed to reach for the stars, would be undone by the very forces of space they were built to navigate. And in that silence, a new age would dawn, not the digital one we know, but something far older, far harsher, a world teetering on the edge of losing its connection to electricity altogether. When the power grids go dark and the satellites fall silent, it is not just machines that vanish, it is an entire way of life. For more than a century, humanity has built its identity around the hum of electricity and the whisper of signals across invisible air. The internet, GPS, and global communication have become so constant that they feel like elements of nature, as if they will always be there, like the sunrise or the tide. But without the magnetic field, those foundations begin to crack, and with them, the digital age itself dissolves. The internet, once a boundless sea of information, would begin to flicker out. Servers require power, Fiber optic networks require stable infrastructure. Satellites once carried signals across oceans. Without them, connections would die link by link until the vast web that once united billions shrank into silence. Imagine typing a message to a loved one overseas and finding nothing but error. Imagine waking to a world without updates, without news, without the constant pulse of voices flowing through glowing screens. The sudden stillness would feel like a new kind of isolation, one more profound than distance. GPS, the invisible map that guides planes, ships, cars, and even pedestrians, would collapse as its satellites failed. Navigation would return to the older arts, stars, compasses, and memory. But even compasses would falter without a magnetic field. Directions would become uncertain, trade routes unpredictable. A journey that once seemed routine, flying from one city to another or shipping food across an ocean, would become dangerous, riddled with error and risk. Global communication, the beating heart of modern civilization, would disintegrate. Cell towers may stand, but without satellites and functioning grids, they would serve only as hollow skeletons. International phone calls would vanish. Video calls, once bridging continents in seconds, would become stories told with disbelief. Communities would shrink back into themselves, no longer connected to the wider world. And in that collapse, humanity would be thrown backward in time, not to the 20th century, not even to the 19th, but to a state older still. A pre-electric existence where messages must be carried by hand, where light is born from flame, where the night grows dark again, unbroken by screens or street lamps. The transition would not be graceful. Cities, designed to run on constant power and constant connection, would suffer most. Skyscrapers without elevators, hospitals without machines, streets without lights, the architecture of the modern age would become monuments to a world that no longer functioned. Rural areas, less dependent on global networks, might adapt more easily, but even they would feel the absence of medicine, of communication, of knowledge once at their fingertips. The collapse of the digital age would not only be practical but cultural. An entire generation raised in the glow of screens would awaken to a silence they had never known. The archives of human thought, music, and art, once stored in clouds of data, would become inaccessible. Knowledge would retreat into what could be written, preserved, and carried in physical form. Libraries would once again become sanctuaries, their shelves holding what the digital memory could no longer keep. It is strange to imagine a humanity that once reached toward the stars through satellites and signals suddenly returned to firelight, parchment, and voices carried on the wind. But without the magnetic field, this is not fantasy, it is inevitability. And so, with technology stripped away, humanity would face its oldest challenge once more: survival in a world unmediated by machines, under skies that had turned hostile, in landscapes reshaped by radiation and storms. With machines silenced and the digital age undone, survival would no longer be measured in convenience but in protection. The surface, bathed in radiation, would become a place only the desperate or the shielded could endure. For those who remained above ground, protective suits would become as essential as clothing. These would not be the sleek uniforms of fiction, but cumbersome layers of shielding, woven from metals, polymers, and reflective films designed to block the constant assault of ultraviolet rays and cosmic particles. To step outside would mean to carry your protection on your back, to breathe through filters, to move slowly under the weight of survival itself. Simple tasks, tending a field, repairing a wall, walking from one home to another, would become exhausting rituals of preparation. Most would not risk it at all. Underground cities, once considered speculative engineering projects or thought experiments, would shift into necessity. Old mines would be repurposed, tunnels expanded, caverns reinforced with steel and concrete. These spaces would not be grand but functional, networks of chambers holding families, farms, water systems, and hospitals. Artificial lighting would mimic day and night, though imperfectly, leaving residents with a sense of perpetual twilight. Daily life would narrow to survival routines, crops grown under lamps powered by whatever energy could be scavenged, livestock raised in carefully ventilated chambers, children playing in corridors lined with stone instead of fields under the sunday, communities shrinking inward, bound by the fragility of their walls and the danger pressing above them. But protection from radiation is not perfect. Even underground, even beneath meters of rock, particles slip through. Over time, illnesses would spread, cancer rates would rise. Genetic mutations, seeded in generations before, would continue to ripple through families. Medical systems, already strained by the collapse of advanced technology, would falter under the pressure. Imagine a hospital carved into stone, its beds filled not only with the sick but with the chronically weakened. Medicines would run scarce, once common treatments becoming luxuries. Doctors would do their best with what remained herbal remedies, improvised surgeries, crude shielding against radiation, but much of what modern medicine relies upon would be gone. Antibiotics, chemotherapy, advanced imaging, even sterile surgical supplies would be treasures of a lost age. The psychological toll would weigh heavily. To live underground is to live without sky, without horizon, without seasons. Generations might grow up never seeing the stars, never feeling rain, never knowing what it means to stand unshielded beneath the open air. Stories of the surface would sound like myths, tales of a paradise poisoned by the sunday. And yet, humans endure. Some would take pride in their resilience, in carving out life where none should exist. Communities would adapt new rituals, new celebrations, finding meaning in survival itself. In the glow of artificial lamps, in the hum of underground farms, in the persistence of song and story, humanity would hold onto its identity. But the price would be steep. Life expectancy would shorten, populations would dwindle. A world of billions would contract into enclaves of thousands, scattered beneath mountains, deserts, and oceans. And over it all would linger the quiet truth. Humanity now lived in a radiation world, its future uncertain, its survival balanced on fragile shields of stone and will. Radiation is both destroyer and sculptor. It shatters DNA, twisting the delicate script of life, but in doing so it forces change. Most mutations are harmful, leading to illness, weakness, or death, but a rare few open new doors. In a world where radiation is constant, where every cell is tested daily by invisible fire, evolution itself would accelerate. For humanity, this pressure would shape the generations to come. Children born in underground cities might carry mutations unknown to their parents. Some would suffer for them fragile immune systems, shortened lifespans, deformities that could not be corrected. Yet others might quietly thrive. Their bodies could learn to repair DNA more efficiently. Their cells could evolve resistance to damage. Over centuries, these survivors might become the foundation of a new kind of human. Speculation paints this future in haunting tones. Imagine people with skin darkened not merely by pigment, but by layers of radiation-resistant compounds, a living shield against the sunday. Imagine eyes adapted to dim light, larger pupils widening to drink in the faint glow of underground lamps or the filtered daylight that reached into caverns. Imagine metabolisms tuned to scarcity, wasting nothing, able to endure famine as easily as feast. Perhaps humanity would split into branches. Those who remained underground, shaped by confinement, might grow smaller, more efficient, their communities compact and tightly bound. Those who dared return to the surface might become something stranger still, a species hardened by radiation, scarred but resilient, living in ruins under skies that once would have killed them, now endured as a constant trial. We see echoes of this already in life around us. Cockroaches endure radiation levels far beyond human tolerance. Tardigrades, microscopic creatures that look like walking tanks, can survive in the vacuum of space itself. If such resilience exists in the smallest forms of life, might not evolution push humans, given time and pressure, in a similar direction? The process would not be gentle. Many lineages would vanish, many families would end, but those who survived would do so because something in them, some flicker of genetic chance, allowed them to withstand what others could not. In this way, the human story would continue, not as a single unbroken line, but as a branching, a divergence into something new. And what would these descendants think of us? Would they look back on the digital age, the time of satellites and skyscrapers, as we look upon cave paintings, relics of a world long gone? Would they carry myths of the surface as a forbidden realm, a place their ancestors once ruled but lost to the anger of the sun? Or would they walk confidently under aurora-filled skies, immune to the dangers that once drove humanity underground, no longer needing to fear the radiation storms? In this future, the question is not whether humanity survives, it is what form humanity takes. Evolution is relentless. It does not preserve, it remakes. And in a radiation world, it would sculpt us into beings suited not to the Earth we knew, but to the Earth that remained. If the surface of Earth becomes unlivable, if radiation carves into the air and scorches the land, there remains one place where life might still find sanctuary: the oceans. Water is more than a cradle of life, it is a shield. Even a few meters of depth softens the fury of ultraviolet radiation, and the deeper you go, the more complete the protection becomes. Beneath the waves, where sunlight fades into twilight, the storm above cannot reach. It would not be the first time the oceans played this role. In Earth's deep past, long before the magnetic field was stable, life began in sheltered pools, under layers of water that blunted the sun's raw power. Microbes learned to photosynthesize in shallow seas, while others hid in the safety of depths and vents. The ocean has always been both nursery and refuge, and in a world stripped of its shield, it would become so again. Marine ecosystems would not escape unscathed. The uppermost layers of the sea, where plankton drift and coral reefs glow, would be scorched by radiation. Coral bleaching would intensify, surface waters would grow harsher, and many delicate organisms would vanish. But below, in deeper zones, life would endure. Fish, crustaceans, cephalopods, and the countless species that never need to surface would carry on, their world dim but comparatively stable. Here, the food web would remain more intact than on land. Algae and phytoplankton that survive just below lethal depths would still feed small creatures, which would in turn feed larger ones. Whales, sharks, and other great hunters might struggle if prey diminished, but the resilience of the sea would surpass that of scorched continents. Evolution would shift its weight underwater, favoring species able to thrive where the sun's fire could not reach. For humanity, this resilience would not go unnoticed. Already pressed into caves and bunkers, people would look toward the ocean with new urgency. Submersible habitats, once experiments of science fiction and engineering ambition, would become lifeboats of civilization. Imagine domes anchored to the seafloor, glowing faintly in the darkness, housing families who farm seaweed and fish, who breathe air recycled through filters and oxygen-extracting machines. Life beneath the ocean would be harsh, claustrophobic, yet safer than the irradiated lands above. In some ways, this would mark a return to origins, for life has always flowed from the ocean's depths. The cycle would come full circle. First cells hiding from ultraviolet light in water, and now, millennia later, humanity itself returning to those same depths for safety. The oceans would cradle us once more, as they once cradled our single-celled ancestors. And for all its hardship, there is something haunting in the thought. On the surface, skies torn open with auroras would burn the land into silence. But far below, among the shifting currents and flicker of bioluminescent creatures, life would go on almost untouched. The ocean, dark and vast, would remain a world apart, a hidden refuge in a planet undone. What begins as refuge does not remain temporary. When generations are born beneath the waves, survival transforms into culture and necessity into identity. In time, humanity would cease to think of itself as a species hiding in the ocean. It would become a species of the ocean. Imagine cities built beneath the seas, vast domes of reinforced glass and metal, latticed structures anchored to the continental shelf, or entire networks of habitats suspended in the twilight zones where light fades but safety deepens. The hum of pumps and oxygen scrubbers would replace the rustle of trees. The rhythms of tides and currents would dictate daily life. Above, the surface would be abandoned to storms and silence, but below, a new kind of civilization would take root. Farms of kelp and seaweed would stretch across the seafloor, their fronds swaying like green forests in slow motion. Schools of fish, carefully managed, would serve as both food and resource, tended like livestock once were on land. Energy might be harvested from geothermal vents, from tidal movements, from the constant pulse of the ocean itself. The architecture of these civilizations would reflect their world. No spires reaching toward the sky, no towers piercing the horizon. Instead, structures would curve inward, embracing pressure, designed to flow with the water around them. Hallways would feel more like tunnels than streets. Communities would cluster in rounded chambers, their lives unfolding in constant twilight, lit by the glow of bioluminescent lamps or engineered organisms bred to shine like living stars. Over time, even the human body might adapt. Lungs trained to live with thinner oxygen, skin paler from lack of sunlight, eyes adjusting to dimness. Perhaps in centuries, underwater humans would look subtly different from their ancestors on land, not monstrous, but adapted, sculpted by pressure and necessity. Culturally, the sea would seep into every story and ritual. Myths would no longer speak of mountains and skies, but of currents, depths, and creatures of the abyss. Children would not learn to draw suns and clouds, but waves and drifting jellyfish. Songs would echo through pressurized halls, carrying the cadence of tides. The ocean has always been a place of mystery to us, a realm unexplored, feared, revered. To live within it would mean embracing that mystery, weaving it into the very fabric of daily life. Humanity would become a species of the deep, its survival no longer tied to soil and sky, but to the sway of currents and the endurance of structures sunk into the abyss. And perhaps in time, these ocean civilizations would look upward again, not with longing but with distance. The surface would seem like myth, a place once real, now dangerous and abandoned. Stories of trees, stars, and open air might be recited with the same awe we now reserve for tales of Atlantis. The old world would fade, and the sea would become the only home humanity knew. Speculation stretches further still. Could such societies last millennia beneath the ocean? Could they thrive, inventing new forms of art, science, and culture in the deep? Or would they remain fragile, always one breach, one system failure away from collapse? The answer is uncertain. Yet if Earth's magnetic shield were gone forever, the ocean would remain the final bastion, the last canvas upon which the human story could be written. The thought of Earth without a magnetic field is terrifying, but it is not entirely beyond the realm of nature. For the truth is this: Earth's field has never been a fixed, eternal thing. It has wavered, faltered, even flipped entirely. The shield that feels so permanent is, in reality, restless. Deep within the molten outer core, where iron churns in colossal loops, the geodynamo sometimes stumbles. The field grows unstable, the north and south poles wander wildly, and then after years, sometimes centuries, they reverse. North becomes south, south becomes north. This process, known as geomagnetic reversal, has happened many times in Earth's history. The rock record bears witness. Cooled lava flows lock in the direction of the field as they harden, and in their layers, scientists find the fingerprints of countless flips stretching back hundreds of millions of years. To life on the surface, these reversals may not have always meant disaster, but they were never without consequence. During the transitions, the field weakens dramatically. For centuries, perhaps longer, the shield becomes patchy, riddled with gaps where radiation can pour through. Imagine auroras not only at the poles but across entire latitudes. Imagine animals confused as their magnetic compasses fail. Imagine Earth exposed in fragments, pieces of its skin peeled away while the field struggles to reorient itself. Even now, signs of weakening surround us. Over the South Atlantic, between South America and Africa, there lies a strange zone where Earth's magnetic field is unusually weak. Known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, it is a place where satellites passing overhead are particularly vulnerable to radiation, where instruments falter and data grows noisy. Scientists watch it closely, debating whether it is merely a temporary wrinkle or the beginning of something larger, the early stages of another reversal. The unsettling truth is that no one knows exactly what will happen when the next flip arrives. Some argue the field will weaken but recover, as it always has. Others warn of centuries of exposure, where humanity would face radiation storms long before the shield stabilized. What is certain is that the field is not static. It breathes, it shifts, it changes, just as the earth beneath our feet does. And so, while the permanent disappearance of the magnetic field may be a nightmare scenario, history reminds us that instability is real. Earth has endured times when its shield faltered, and life was forced to endure beneath skies more dangerous than our own. The question is not whether the field can change, it is when and how dramatically. What if Earth's magnetic field did not vanish forever, but only for a time? What if, as in ages past, it faltered, grew weak, even disappeared almost entirely, before stirring back to life centuries later? This is not fantasy. Geological records suggest it has happened before. During reversals, the field does not flip in a single day. It weakens, fragments, sometimes collapsing to a fraction of its strength, leaving the planet partially exposed. In those fragile centuries, radiation would surge through the gaps, the atmosphere would erode more quickly, and the balance of life would strain under the pressure. Then, slowly, the dynamo would recover, the lines of force reweaving themselves, a new north and south settling into place. For humanity, such an interval would be long enough to reshape civilization. Imagine being born into a world where the magnetic field had already failed, growing up beneath aurora-filled skies, living with protective suits, underground farms, and fragile communities hidden from radiation. To you, that would not be a catastrophe, it would be normal. Generations would pass before anyone alive had memory of a stronger shield. Entire cultures would rise beneath weakened skies, telling stories of an Earth once safer, once calmer, once brighter. The struggle would be immense. Power grids, satellites, navigation, all would remain crippled. Agriculture would cling to survival underground or underwater. Medicine would falter, populations would shrink, and survival would depend on resilience, adaptation, and cooperation. Humanity would learn to live in enclaves, scattered pockets of endurance stitched together by trade and tenuous communication. And then, centuries later, when the geodynamo roared back to life and the magnetic field recovered, what would remain of us? Would the survivors emerge from caves and ocean domes to reclaim the surface, their myths of danger giving way to the rediscovery of the sky? Or would they already be so transformed biologically, culturally, spiritually that the return of the shield would matter little? Their new lives too far removed from the world that came before. Speculation allows us to see both possibilities. Perhaps humanity would use the gap as a crucible, forging new resilience, evolving under pressure, becoming a species capable of enduring even in the absence of protection. Or perhaps the centuries of struggle would thin our numbers so drastically that by the time the shield returned, only fragments of civilization remained. Whispers of a species that once reached for the stars but was forced back into the stone and sea. A temporary collapse would not mean the end of Earth, but it could mean the end of the Earth we know. And the gap, those exposed centuries between protection lost and protection regained, would be long enough to test the very limits of endurance. To understand what Earth might become without its magnetic shield, we need only look outward to our planetary neighbors, Mars and Venus. Each offers a lesson written in rock and atmosphere, a cautionary tale of what happens when a world stands exposed before the Sunday. Mars, small and cold, once may have been warmer, wetter, and more inviting. Ancient riverbeds snake across its surface. Minerals tell of lakes and seas that once shimmered under its skies. But its molten core cooled too quickly, its dynamo sputtered out, and the magnetic field disappeared. Without protection, the solar wind carved into the atmosphere, stripping it away molecule by molecule. Today, Mars has only a whisper of air, a thin veil of carbon dioxide that cannot hold warmth, cannot shield against radiation. Its oceans are gone, locked as ice in the soil or lost to space. The Mars we see silent, red, frozen, is a monument to what happens when a planet loses its shield. Venus, by contrast, tells a different story. It still has an atmosphere, but it is thick, heavy, and toxic. With little protection from solar particles, its upper atmosphere has been battered, stripped, and reshaped, yet its immense gravity holds onto dense layers of carbon dioxide. The result is a greenhouse world, smothered by clouds of sulfuric acid, its surface hot enough to melt lead. Where Mars froze, Venus burned. Both are warnings, two paths a world can take when magnetism no longer holds the sun at bay. And then there is Earth, balanced delicately between them, not as small as Mars, not as burdened as Venus. Our shield has given us oceans, skies, and forests, a planet where life can flourish. But remove that shield, and we could drift toward either fate, a slow desiccation into a barren desert, or a spiraling greenhouse collapse. The difference may lie in timing, in chance, in how long the atmosphere can endure the storm before it thins or thickens beyond recovery. Looking at Mars and Venus is like gazing into two mirrors. One shows a world stripped to silence, the other a world drowned in poison. Between them, Earth stands fragile, sustained only by an invisible force rising from its molten heart. It is humbling to realize how rare this balance might be, how fragile the shield is that makes rivers run and skies sing. In the cold vacuum of space, magnetic fields may be less common than we think, and perhaps it is only by fortune that Earth has held its shield for so long. When we look at Earth, it is tempting to see its magnetic field as ordinary, just another feature of a planet, like mountains or rivers. But the more we search beyond our world, the more extraordinary it seems. Out of the countless exoplanets discovered orbiting distant stars, how many truly cradle life? And of those, how many are wrapped in invisible shields strong enough to guard their skies? A magnetic field is not guaranteed. It requires a molten, churning core, convection currents that do not freeze too soon, a balance of chemistry and rotation that keeps the geodynamo alive. Mars lost its field when its heart cooled. Venus rotates too slowly, its dynamo stifled beneath crushing layers of heat and atmosphere. Even among planets of our solar system, Earth's shield is the exception, not the rule. Without such protection, a world may form oceans, may even spark the beginnings of life, but its story often ends in silence. Radiation scours its surface, atmospheres thin or thicken into poison. The delicate chemistry of biology struggles to endure under the constant assault of cosmic particles. Life, if it ever begins, may not last long enough to flourish. This makes Earth's history feel less like inevitability and more like miracle. For billions of years our field has held, waxing and waning, flipping and wandering, but always returning, always strong enough to guard us from the chaos of space. It has allowed oceans to endure, air to thicken, forests to rise, and humanity to dream beneath safe skies. Speculation stretches outward. If magnetic fields are rare, then perhaps so is life like ours. Perhaps civilizations across the galaxy are few, not because planets are rare, but because shields are fragile. Without one, most worlds may remain barren, frozen, or poisoned. With one, a planet may sing with rivers, forests, and mines capable of wonder. To think of Earth this way is to see its uniqueness more clearly. We are not simply fortunate to have oceans or atmosphere. We are fortunate to have a shield, a silent guardian born from fire, invisible but indispensable, shaping not only our survival but our ability to thrive. And so, when we ask what would happen if Earth's magnetic field disappeared, we are not only imagining catastrophe, we are glimpsing how easily our planet could have been otherwise, how narrow the path has always been between a living Earth and a silent one. If Earth's magnetic field were to vanish permanently, if the dynamo at its core ceased to stir and never again found its rhythm, the consequences would unfold not in a single apocalypse, but in a long, relentless erosion of everything that makes Earth alive. The loss would not be sudden thunder, but a drawn-out silence. What begins as a faint change in the skies would, over centuries, become the unraveling of the planet itself. The earliest stages would be almost invisible. The solar wind, that ceaseless gale of charged particles flowing outward from the sun, would meet no shield as it struck the planet. Instead, it would graze directly against the atmosphere, stealing away molecules one by one. At first, these losses would be negligible, amounts so small no one could measure them without the keenest instruments. But erosion has patience. Like rivers carving valleys or tides grinding stone into sand, the solar wind would peel Earth's breath away, layer by layer. Oxygen and nitrogen, the twin pillars of our air, would be swept into space, spiraling along the magnetic lines that no longer anchored them to Earth. Hydrogen, lightest of all, would flee most quickly. It would rise to the edge of the atmosphere and vanish into the void, carrying with it the very essence of water. At first, the change would be imperceptible. The air would still taste the same, lungs would still fill with ease. But in time, decades at first and then centuries, the difference would grow undeniable. Breathing would feel harder, thinner, like climbing a mountain that grows steeper every year. The oceans, too, would begin to fade. Their vast surfaces, no longer held in balance by a stable atmosphere, would evaporate more quickly under the sun's glare. Each droplet that rose would have a greater chance of being lost forever, its hydrogen torn free by solar wind, its oxygen left behind to bind with rocks or vanish into space. Seas would shrink, coastlines would retreat, rivers would fail. What once were fertile deltas would harden into salt flats, their cracked surfaces gleaming like scars beneath the sky. Lakes would vanish in lifetimes. The rhythm of the tides would continue, but only across ever smaller shores, their once endless pulse reduced to whispers. As the atmosphere thinned, the very look of the world would change. With less air to scatter blue light, the sky would deepen into a harsher, darker shade. Days would grow sharp, the sun glaring with unsoftened brilliance. Nights would blaze with stars, brilliant and cold, no longer blurred by the soft lens of a thick atmosphere. For poets and dreamers, it would seem beautiful, a world where the heavens were laid bare. But the beauty would be a warning. The shield was gone, and with it the protection that let life thrive in the open air. Forests would wither as the balance of gases shifted. Leaves would yellow, branches would bare themselves, roots would reach into soil that grew drier with every passing decade. Grasslands would fade into brittle plains. Crops, already strained by climate chaos and radiation, would fail entirely in the thinning air. Animals would struggle not only against the poison of radiation but against suffocation, their lungs starved, their blood unable to carry enough oxygen to fuel their bodies. Herds would dwindle, birds would drop from the skies. Even the insects, so resilient and numerous, would falter as their fragile wings beat in air too thin to sustain them. Humanity, ever inventive, would cling on. Artificial habitats would rise, domes filled with manufactured air, underground bunkers sealed against the thinning sky, ocean habitats drawing on water as shield and sustenance. Within these refuges, life would continue, carefully measured, carefully preserved. Oxygen would be generated from machines, every breath recycled, every exhalation accounted for. To step outside would no longer be a rite of birth but a death sentence. The open earth, its forests, mountains, rivers and skies would become a memory carried in books, paintings and stories, not in lived experience. The decline would not stop there. Over millennia, the collapse would accelerate. With oceans shrinking, Earth would lose its climate regulator. No great blue expanses to absorb and release heat, no currents to balance poles against equator. Temperatures would swing wildly, scorching during the day, freezing at night. The winds would weaken as the atmosphere thinned, and eventually even rain would vanish, leaving continents cracked and silent. Storms might rage in the early centuries, violent and chaotic, but as the atmosphere drained away, they too would fade. Silence would spread. What would remain is a barren world, stripped by time rather than violence. No sudden apocalypse, no single day of reckoning, but a gradual transformation. Rivers drying, oceans shrinking, skies thinning, air failing, until nothing remained but dust and stone. The monuments of humanity would crumble into ruins, scattered across a lifeless earth. Skyscrapers would collapse into sand, bridges would fall into dried riverbeds. Carved faces on mountains and temples would weather into formlessness. All the noise of civilization would vanish, leaving fossils and ruins as whispers of what once lived here. In this vision, Earth would not explode or shatter. It would fade quietly, inevitably into silence. A twin to Mars, but bearing the ghosts of oceans, forests, and lives that once thrived. A planet that had everything necessary for life, but lost it to the failure of a single hidden force, the dynamo deep beneath its surface. And so Earth, the jewel of the solar system, would stand barren and mute, its history etched only in stone. Another world undone by the loss of its invisible guardian. But perhaps this is not the final end. Perhaps the dynamo at Earth's heart, though it falters, is not extinguished forever. Just as it has many times in the past, perhaps it might weaken, collapse, and then centuries or millennia later stir again. If so, the story of humanity and Earth would not close upon silence, but bend instead toward rebirth. In this vision, the intervening years would be an age of endurance. Beneath mountains, inside sealed bunkers, within domes anchored to the ocean floor, small enclaves of humanity would persist. They would be shadows of the once vast population, reduced to thousands or tens of thousands, their days spent in the careful balance of survival. Underground farms lit by lamps, water distilled and recycled endlessly, every tool and every breath accounted for, with nothing wasted. For the generations born there, this would not feel like survival at all, but life as it has always been. The surface, the sky, the open air, these would be stories told by elders, myths that once belonged to a brighter age. Time, however, has a way of shaping perspective. After centuries, when memory fades and history bends into legend, the field would begin to return. At first, the signs would be subtle, auroras dimming, cosmic rays easing, the skies growing calmer. Slowly, the invisible lines of magnetism would reweave themselves around the planet, strengthening year by year, decade by decade. Earth, once vulnerable, would begin to guard itself again. For the survivors below, this regeneration would mark the beginning of a great decision. Do they remain in the safety of their stone and steel refuges, or do they dare to climb back into the open? Imagine the first explorers emerging from caverns into a world quiet, scarred, but habitable once more. The air, though thin, would sustain. The sun, though harsh, would no longer kill. And above, the skies, once a theatre of deadly auroras, would calm into the familiar blues of old. The return to the surface would not be immediate. Caution would reign. Suits and shelters would still be necessary. Experiments made to test air, soil, and water. But step by step, generation by generation, people would reclaim the land. Settlements would rise from ruins. Fields would be planted once again under the open sky. Domes would give way to villages, villages to towns, and towns to cities. What would emerge from such an age would not be the same civilization that fell. It would be one reborn from struggle, carrying the scars of centuries underground. Its myths would tell of fire skies, of radiation storms, of ancestors who lived in darkness. Its culture would value resilience, frugality, and reverence for the shield above, now recognized not as an invisible constant but as the most vital of gifts. Perhaps new religions would form around the return of the field, celebrating it as divine renewal, the rebirth of the world. Perhaps science and philosophy would merge, teaching every child not only how the shield works but why it matters, embedding in human identity the truth that survival is bound to forces beneath the earth as much as above it. And with rebirth would come opportunity, a civilization that had nearly ended, pared down to its essentials, would rise with clarity. Technologies would be rebuilt not for convenience but for endurance. Cities would be designed with the memory of collapse etched into every wall. Humanity would step forward again, wiser, humbled, and more aware of its fragile place in the cosmos. This possibility that the field may return, that humanity may endure long enough to meet it, gives the story of collapse a thread of hope. For it suggests that even in the face of centuries of darkness, the human story does not have to end. It may bend, it may break, it may retreat into shadows, but it can also re-emerge, carrying with it the resilience of survival and the chance to begin again. And so, if Earth's magnetic field regenerates, then the end is not an ending at all. It is a pause, a long and difficult winter, followed by the first hesitant steps of spring. When survival depends on invisible forces, the lesson becomes unforgettable. A civilization reborn after centuries of exposure would not easily trust the earth to protect it again. The memory of collapse of skies turned deadly, of oceans retreating, of generations forced underground would shape every decision. And so humanity, no longer content to depend solely on the restless dynamo in Earth's core, would turn its eyes upward and ask, what if we could build a shield of our own? The idea is not beyond imagination. Already scientists speak of artificial magnetospheres, vast magnetic structures placed in orbit to deflect solar wind. One proposal envisions a giant magnetic dipole positioned at the lone Lagrange point, a place where the gravitational pull of Earth and Sun balance. There, a shield could unfurl, a bubble of magnetism large enough to bend the solar wind, to protect not only satellites but the entire planet. What Earth's core once did by nature, humanity might learn to do by design. Such a project would be monumental. It would demand resources on a planetary scale, superconducting coils stretching for kilometers, powered by solar arrays or fusion reactors, maintained by fleets of orbital stations. It would not be the work of one nation, or even a handful. It would be the endeavor of humanity as a whole, a collective recognition that survival depends on cooperation. The vision is staggering, an artificial guardian suspended in space, invisible to the eye, yet shaping the fate of every life below. For the first time, We would not only endure the forces of the cosmos, we would meet them with intention. Science would no longer simply describe the world, it would stand as the last defense between life and silence. Yet such ambition would carry risks. A shield of this scale could fail if neglected. It could become a point of tension: who controls it, who funds it, who decides its priorities. And there is always the danger of arrogance, that in believing we have mastered the shield, we forget the fragility of the balance beneath us. Still, the attempt itself would mark a turning point. No longer passive recipients of protection, humanity would step into the role of guardian. In this way, the trauma of collapse would be transformed into action, the memory of loss fueling innovation, the fear of silence giving birth to resilience. The creation of an artificial magnetosphere would not erase the dangers of space, but it would offer a measure of control. A chance, however fragile, to write a different story than Mars or Venus. And in that act of defiance against the void, humanity would declare that even if the Earth falters, the will to endure remains unbroken. But survival on this scale is never free. To build an artificial magnetosphere, to sustain underground cities, to preserve life through centuries of exposure, these are feats that would demand everything humanity has to give. The cost would not only be measured in resources or labor, it would be measured in the very shape of civilization itself. In a fractured world, nations compete, borders divide, economies rise and fall in rivalry. Yet in a world stripped of its magnetic shield, rivalry would become a luxury no one could afford. The Earth itself would be the enemy, or rather, the void pressing down upon it. Against such a universal threat, survival could no longer be organized along the old lines. Perhaps nations would dissolve, their flags and identities swallowed by the urgency of survival enclaves. Imagine enclaves rising in mountain caverns, under ice sheets, or beneath seas, each designed not around culture or history but around necessity. The shared goal would not be glory or expansion but endurance. In these pockets of life, the language of survival might be mathematics, engineering, and biology, the only currencies that matter when the air itself is at risk. Speculation suggests two possible paths. In one, humanity unites. Borders dissolve not in conquest but in consensus, and a single planetary government emerges, dedicated to building and maintaining the shield. Resources are pooled, technologies shared, and survival becomes a collective project, a rare moment when the species sees itself not as fractured tribes but as one organism with one future. In the other path, cooperation collapses. Nations cling to their own, hoarding resources, sealing their enclaves, and abandoning others to die. Competition over oxygen, water, and safe refuges leads to conflict. Wars erupt not for land or ideology, but for breathable air and habitable stone. The artificial shield, if it is ever built, becomes the property of the powerful few, defended with the desperation of survival. Billions die, and what remains of humanity fractures into scattered, mistrustful remnants, each telling their own story of betrayal. Either way, the cost is profound. Entire cultures would vanish. Languages might go extinct as enclaves merged, memories of diversity fading in the face of necessity. Religion might shift into new forms, worshipping not the gods of land and sky but the shield itself, the unseen barrier that determines who lives and who dies. Philosophy would tilt toward survival, ethics rewritten around scarcity. In this way, the disappearance of Earth's magnetic field would not only strip away air and oceans, it would strip away the structures of human civilization as we know them. Nations, borders, and governments' concepts so dominant in the modern world would be revealed as temporary scaffolding, fragile against the scale of cosmic danger. What would endure, perhaps, is smaller, the human instinct to adapt, to endure together, to build meaning even in the dark. Survival enclaves may not preserve nations, but they would preserve people, and through people, the story of humanity would continue. When stripped to its core, the story of Earth without its magnetic field is not only about science, survival, or even civilization. It is about perspective. It forces us to confront a truth that lies beneath all our achievements. We endure only because of a shield we cannot see. Every breath you take, every river that runs, every tree that stretches upward is made possible by this invisible guardian. It bends solar winds, deflects cosmic rays, and softens the constant storm of space. Without it, Earth would not be Earth. And yet, how rarely do we think of it? How rarely do we remember that our lives rest upon a force we never touch, never hear, never truly feel. This is the paradox of life's fragility. We build cities that scrape the sky. We split atoms, traverse oceans, and send machines into the stars. And yet, all of it rests upon a magnetic veil thinner than our awareness, vulnerable to forces far beyond our control. Remove it, and the greatest achievements of our species collapse into silence. To imagine Earth without its field is to glimpse our place in the cosmos with sharper clarity. It reminds us that life is not guaranteed, not even on a world as rich as ours. Against the backdrop of stars, where radiation and vacuum rule, life is the rarest thing of all, a brief flame protected by chance alignments of fire, stone, and magnetism. Philosophy here becomes less abstract and more urgent. What does it mean to live knowing that existence is so precarious? That survival depends not only on our choices but on the restless churn of iron beneath our feet. Perhaps the lesson is humility, the recognition that we are not masters of our world but children of its balance. Perhaps the lesson is gratitude that in all the vast silence of the universe we were given a shield that let us flourish. And perhaps it is a call to attention. For if survival depends on an invisible shield, then life itself is an act of trust. Trust in forces we do not control. Trust in a planet whose heart has not yet failed. Every sunrise is not just a cycle of light, but a quiet reassurance. The field still holds. The shield still bends the storm. The world is still alive. To live without protection is to understand protection more deeply. To imagine the loss is to see the gift, and in that reflection lies the deepest philosophy of all, that we are fragile, yes, but also fortunate. We exist not because we conquered the cosmos, but because, for now, the cosmos allows us to be. If philosophy gives us perspective, poetry gives us language to hold it. And when we think of Earth's magnetic field, poetry may be the only frame wide enough to capture both its silence and its splendor. For though invisible in its daily work, the field reveals itself in moments of breathtaking beauty, the auroras. Imagine a sky torn open by color, curtains of green and violet rippling across the horizon, rivers of light flowing where darkness should reign. To stand beneath an aurora is to feel as though the heavens themselves are alive, dancing in slow, silent waves. It is a sight so haunting that humans have woven it into myth for millennia. The spears of gods, the souls of the departed, the bridge between worlds. And yet this beauty is born from violence. Each shimmering wave of light is a sign of the storm, charged particles from the sun colliding with Earth's atmosphere, striking atoms of oxygen and nitrogen until they glow. The aurora is both warning and wonder, beauty masking death. When the field is strong, the aurora is confined to the poles, a rare spectacle. But in a world without protection, it would spill across every latitude, flooding the skies nightly, turning the planet into a theater of light. At first, humanity might marvel. Cities, stripped of electricity, would look upward and see the heavens painted with fire. Children would trace the glowing veils with wide eyes, lovers would stand in silence, the sky itself a canvas of impossible colors. But beneath the awe would lie the truth. Each flicker of light carried radiation with it, each shimmering wave a reminder of the shield now lost. The aurora would be not only the most beautiful sight humanity had ever known, but also the most deadly. In such a world, memory would linger. Generations living underground or beneath the seas would tell stories of the auroras not as symbols of romance or wonder, but as omens. They would remember that the shield once made those lights rare, a glimpse of mystery at the edges of the world. They would remember that without it, the aurora was everywhere, and that everywhere it appeared, it sang both life and death. And so the magnetic field, though invisible, would become humanity's most silent guardian in memory and myth. It would be spoken of as one speaks of a lost parent, unseen yet foundational, forgotten in life but revered in absence. Children might be told that the field was the cloak of the earth, a garment that wrapped the planet and kept it safe, a cloak that one day slipped away. The auroras, beautiful and terrible, would be remembered as the tears of that lost guardian, still shimmering across the sky long after the protection was gone. In the end, the poetry of the magnetic field lies not only in its science but in its silence. It asks for nothing, it announces nothing, and yet without it, nothing we know could exist. It is protection without pride, endurance without recognition, beauty without boast. And perhaps that is why it feels so haunting. It is the most necessary thing we never see. The story of Earth's magnetic field is, at its heart, the story of life itself. A force we never see, never touch, and yet one that has shaped every breath, every ocean, every blade of grass. It is the silent architecture of survival, a shield that has guarded us for billions of years. And yet, for all its power, we live most of our days without even a passing thought of it. To imagine its loss is to imagine the unraveling of everything we know, not in fire and ruin, but in silence, the slow theft of air, the retreat of oceans, the bending of forests and civilizations beneath storms of radiation. A long erosion, until Earth is no longer the blue world of rivers and skies, but another barren sphere adrift among countless others. And still, the question remains, if the shield were to vanish, would humanity vanish with it? Or would we endure, retreating into the dark, adapting beneath the seas, reshaping ourselves until we were something new? Is survival enough, or would the cost be too great? The sky, the air, the world itself surrendered to the void? In this reflection lies the truth of our fragility, that we are here not because we are strong, but because the cosmos has, for now, allowed us a shield, a fragile, shifting guardian, born in the restless fire of the Earth's heart. And so, the haunting image lingers, a darkened Earth, its atmosphere bleeding into space, oceans dwindling, forests fading, while the cosmos looks on in silence. No cry, no warning, only the quiet unraveling of a world that once burned with life, shielded by a force it never saw, but always needed.